Sunlight dies long before it reaches the floor of the ocean. Down here, the world is a heavy, soundless blue. Lyra drifted through the cold currents, her movements fluid and effortless, yet she moved with the aimlessness of a ghost. Above her, a dark, jagged shape blocked the faint light. A boat. She tilted her head, watching the shadow glide. She kicked upward, her fingers straining toward the surface, but the pressure of the deep water pushed back. She watched the silhouette vanish into the distance, taking the warmth of the upper world with it. The ocean provided everything she needed to survive, yet it offered nothing to fill the hollow space in her chest. She pressed her palms against the freezing water, feeling the vibration of distant, muffled laughter from the world she could never touch. "What does it feel like?" she whispered to the empty dark, "to not be alone?" The ocean gave no answer. Above the waves, the air was sharp and tasted of salt. Jack stood on the deck of his boat, his feet bracing against the constant, rhythmic roll of the sea. He gripped the rough hemp rope, his palms mapped with thick, hardened calluses that caught on the fibers. He hauled the net upward, muscles in his shoulders bunching and straining with the effort. The rope groaned against the wood, wet and heavy, but as the mesh broke the surface, it hung limp and vacant. He pulled the empty net onto the deck, the water dripping from the knots in a steady, mocking rhythm. Jack wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, leaving a smear of brine. He scanned the horizon, his eyes narrowed against the glare, searching for a ripple or a sign of life that never came. The boat creaked, a hollow sound that echoed his own exhaustion. He had done this every day for years, casting his hope into the dark water, only to retrieve nothing but the weight of his own fatigue. He sat on the edge of the bench, his shoulders slumping, and stared at the vast, empty expanse of the horizon. The sea was a silent partner that refused to provide. The horizon vanished first. A wall of bruised purple cloud rolled in, swallowing the last of the afternoon light. The air pressure dropped so sharply it made the ears ache. Jack stood, his hand gripping the mast as the boat lurched. The sea, once a flat expanse, began to heave in jagged, uneven mounds. A sudden gust of wind tore the hat from his head. He lunged for the rigging, his boots sliding on the wet deck, but a massive swell slammed into the hull. Above, the sky fractured with a jagged streak of white, followed by a roar that drowned out his own shout. The storm had arrived, and the ocean was tearing the world apart. The final wave shattered the hull. Jack was thrown into the churning dark, the surface vanishing behind a wall of suffocating bubbles. He kicked, but the weight of the water pinned him, dragging him down into the freezing silence of the abyss. Lyra felt the tremor of the impact, a sharp, jagged spike in the rhythmic pulse of the ocean. She turned, her eyes catching the silhouette. She froze. This was the forbidden world, the place of shadows she had watched only from the safety of the distance. Lyra surged forward, her tail cutting through the freezing currents with violent speed. She reached him just as his eyes rolled back. She locked her arms around him, feeling the cold seep into her own skin. With every ounce of her strength, she kicked against the crushing weight. The storm above roared, the waves fought to sink, but she drove upward, refusing to stop until his head finally broke the surface. The tide retreated, leaving behind a silence broken only by the rhythmic slap of water against stone. Jack lay sprawled on the wet sand, his chest heaving with ragged, painful gasps. Salt crusted his skin, and his limbs felt heavy, like lead pulled from the deep. He pressed his palms into the grit, trying to push himself upright, but his muscles betrayed him. He collapsed back, his eyes fluttering open to a gray, indifferent sky. He was alone. The boat was gone, and the sea offered no explanation for his survival. He whispered a question to the wind, but the only answer was the hiss of the receding surf. Hidden behind a jagged, barnacle-crusted rock, Lyra watched and saw the confusion etched into his features. When he finally managed to stand, stumbling toward the dunes, she remained in the shallows. The next day she returned. She watched him as he walked the shoreline, searching for debris. The day after that, she was there again, tucked beneath the surface, tracking his movements as he built a small fire. The act of watching became her new rhythm. Every time he stopped to rest, she drifted closer, keeping to the deep, her loneliness softening into a quiet, persistent curiosity. The sun began to dip, leaving gold across the surface of the bay. Jack stood at the water's edge, his gaze fixed on the horizon, when a flicker of light caught his attention. It was not the reflection of the sun, but a shimmer from beneath the waves, pulsing with a rhythmic, iridescent glow. He took a step forward, his heart hammering against his ribs. The water surged, not with the violence of the storm, but with a deliberate, gentle grace. Lyra broke the surface. She stopped, her eyes wide, scanning the shore with a sharp, guarded intensity. Jack froze. The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with the weight of the night he had nearly lost his life. He saw the way she held herself, poised to dive back into the depths at the slightest sign of threat. He did not move, afraid that even a breath might shatter the moment. Lyra took a tentative step toward the shallows, her gaze locked onto his. The silence stretched, heavy and profound, until Jack found his voice. It came out as a ragged, trembling whisper. "You were there," he said, his eyes searching hers. "You saved me, didn't you?" Lyra looked down, her shoulders dropping, and she gave a slow, deliberate nod. The fear evaporated as the sun slipped below the horizon, leaving behind a twilight blue that felt like a sanctuary. They met each evening at the same jagged point where the land met the sea. Jack sat on the damp sand, his back against the rock, while Lyra remained partially submerged, her hands resting on the stones. The first few nights were filled with hesitant questions. Jack spoke of the weight of his failures, the long days of empty nets, and the crushing isolation of a life lived entirely on the surface. Lyra listened, her head tilted, absorbing the rhythm of his voice as if it were a new current. In return, she described the deep. They found a rhythm in the exchange. Jack would describe the warmth of a fire or the smell of rain on dry earth, and Lyra would translate those sensations into the language of the ocean. The loneliness that had defined both their lives began to fray at the edges. They were no longer just two beings from separate worlds. They were two voices finding a common language in the quiet. Every evening ended in a comfortable silence, a shared space where the vast distance between the depths and the shore finally felt bridgeable. For the first time, the world did not feel like a place of survival, but a place of connection. The air grew cold as the moon rose, casting long, sharp shadows across the sand. Lyra moved closer, but she stopped inches away from his hand. The reality of their existence settled between them like a physical barrier. She looked at the horizon, then back at him, her voice cracking as she spoke. "I cannot stay here. I do not belong in your world, and the surface will eventually claim my strength." Jack reached out, his fingers hovering over the water, but he pulled back, knowing the truth. "And I cannot follow you," he whispered. "The depths would take my breath before I ever reached your home." The silence that followed was no longer a sanctuary. It was a wall. They sat in the stillness, the distance between them suddenly vast and unbridgeable. Lyra stood, her movements fluid and final. She looked at him one last time, a silent plea for understanding, before she turned toward the dark expanse of the bay. With a single, powerful motion, she slipped beneath the surface, the water closing over her without a ripple. Jack remained on the shore, his hands still outstretched. The waves continued their rhythmic pulse, indifferent to the space she had left behind. He stood alone, the cold wind biting at his skin, watching the spot where she had vanished. The days that followed were not defined by the absence of the sea, but by the memory of the one who had pulled him from it. Jack returned to the docks, but the man who cast his nets was different. He no longer fished only for survival. When he saw a neighbor struggling with a broken boat, he stopped to repair it. When he found a younger fisherman lost in the same despair he had once known, he sat with him and listened. He shared his meager catch with those who had nothing, turning his small boat into a vessel of support. The bitterness that had once clouded his eyes vanished, replaced by a steady, quiet resolve. He became a fixture of the harbor, a man who understood that life was not meant to be endured in isolation. He moved through the village, lifting those who were sinking, his hands always ready to reach out. Far below the surface, where the light turned to a soft, permanent indigo, Lyra watched. She saw the changes in the harbor, the way the people gathered around him, and the way the atmosphere of the coast had shifted from cold indifference to a fragile, growing warmth. She did not approach the surface again. She did not need to. She drifted in the currents, her movements slow and rhythmic.